the 14th of September, 1943, 3:27 a.m. Antonio Scalise jolted awake in his Brooklyn bedroom, drenched in sweat and shaking uncontrollably. For the third consecutive night, he'd experienced the same horrifying nightmare. Lucky Luciano standing at the foot of his bed, smiling coldly, whispering, "Your time is up, Antonio." The dream felt so real that Scalise reached for his bedside gun, expecting to find an intruder, but the room was empty, just like the previous nights. What Antonio didn't know was that his nightmares weren't random psychological phenomena. They were carefully orchestrated psychological warfare conducted by Lucky Luciano from his prison cell 200 miles away. Over the next 3 months, the nightmares would intensify, sleep would become impossible, and paranoia would consume Antonio's mind until he made the final decision that Lucky had been programming him to make: suicide. Lucky Luciano had discovered that the most effective way to eliminate enemies wasn't through bullets or bombs, it was through mind control. To understand how Lucky Luciano became a master of psychological warfare and mental manipulation, you need to understand the limitations he was facing by 1943. He'd been in prison for 7 years, serving a 30 to 50-year sentence that effectively removed him from direct control over his criminal organization. Traditional methods of eliminating enemies, sending gunmen, arranging accidents, orchestrating rivalries, were impossible when he couldn't meet with associates, coordinate operations, or even communicate freely with the outside world. But imprisonment had given Lucky something that freedom couldn't provide: time to study, think, and develop new approaches to power that didn't require physical presence or direct action. He'd spent years in the prison library reading books on psychology, human behavior, and mental conditioning. Works by Sigmund Freud, Carl Jung, and Ivan Pavlov became his textbooks for understanding how the human mind could be manipulated and controlled. Lucky had observed how solitary confinement affected other prisoners, how isolation and sensory deprivation could break men who had never been broken by violence. He watched hardened criminals reduced to babbling madness through psychological pressure alone. He studied how rumors and whispered threats could accomplish what physical beatings could not. Lucky realized that the human mind was more vulnerable than the human body, that fear was more destructive than force, and that psychological pressure applied correctly could achieve results that physical violence couldn't match. Most importantly, he discovered that mental manipulation could be conducted from a distance, through intermediaries, without leaving evidence that could be traced back to the orchestrator. The inspiration for Lucky's psychological warfare campaign came from his observation of prison dynamics and his understanding of how information and influence could be weaponized. In prison, rumors and whispered conversations could destroy a man's reputation, create enemies, or drive someone to suicide more effectively than any physical assault. Lucky recognized that the same principles could be applied on a larger scale to eliminate threats to his organization. The key insight was that every person, no matter how strong or dangerous, had psychological vulnerabilities that could be exploited through careful manipulation of their environment, relationships, and information sources. The process required patience, planning, and precise execution, but it was virtually undetectable and almost impossible to counter once it was properly implemented. Lucky began developing his psychological warfare methodology by studying specific cases of mental breakdown and suicide among criminals and non-criminals alike. He identified patterns in how psychological pressure accumulated, how fear compounded over time, and how seemingly minor stresses could combine to create overwhelming psychological crisis. His research revealed that effective psychological manipulation required 3 key elements: trusted sources for planting suggestions, environmental reinforcement of fears, and systematic disruption of the target's mental stability. The process had to be subtle enough to avoid detection while being persistent enough to create cumulative psychological damage. Lucky's first target was Antonio Scalise, a Brooklyn crime boss who had been attempting to expand his territory into areas controlled by Lucky's organization. While Lucky was imprisoned, Scalise was a dangerous enemy, smart, violent, well-connected, and ambitious. He controlled significant criminal operations and had been building alliances with other families that could threaten Lucky's position when he eventually returned from prison. Traditional enforcement methods would have required extensive planning, significant risk to Lucky's associates, and probable federal investigation. But psychological warfare offered a cleaner solution that could eliminate Scalise without violence, without risk to Lucky's organization, and without creating evidence that could be used in criminal prosecutions. Lucky began by having Meyer Lansky conduct a detailed psychological profile of Antonio Scalise. The investigation took 3 months and involved interviewing dozens of people who had interacted with Scalise over the years. The investigation revealed crucial information about Scalise's personality, fears, and vulnerabilities that would become the foundation for the psychological warfare operation. Scalise was superstitious, believing in curses, omens, and supernatural influences on human affairs. He was prone to paranoia, particularly about betrayal and assassination, fears that stemmed from childhood trauma when his father had been murdered by rivals. He suffered from intermittent insomnia that was exacerbated by stress and anxiety. Most importantly, Scalise trusted 3 people completely: his longtime bodyguard Vincent Torino, his personal barber Giuseppe Martino, and his closest friend since childhood, Michael Romano. These 3 relationships would become the primary weapons in Lucky's psychological warfare campaign. By recruiting these trusted associates and turning them into psychological operatives, Lucky could implant suggestions, reinforce fears, and create the environmental conditions necessary to destroy Scalise's mental stability. Lucky's strategy was to use these trusted relationships to implant psychological suggestions that would gradually destroy Scalise's mental stability through a process that would appear to be natural psychological deterioration rather than deliberate manipulation. The operation would be conducted through seemingly innocent conversations, casual comments, and subtle behavioral changes that would create cumulative psychological pressure designed to drive Scalise toward self-destruction. The recruitment of Vincent Torino, Scalise's bodyguard, was handled by Frank Costello during a carefully orchestrated encounter at a Brooklyn social club. Torino had been protecting Scalise for over 5 years, but he was struggling financially and felt underappreciated by his employer. Costello offered him $5,000 and guaranteed protection from retaliation in exchange for conducting subtle psychological operations against Scalise. Torino's assignment wasn't to harm Scalise physically or steal information. It was to plant suggestions and reinforce fears through carefully timed comments and behavioral changes. He would receive specific instructions about what topics to introduce, what fears to reinforce, and how to gradually increase psychological pressure without arousing suspicion. Torino began making subtle references to Lucky Luciano during his daily interactions with Scalise. The comments were designed to be casual and seemingly random, but they served to keep Lucky's name and potential threat constantly present in Scalise's consciousness. "Boss, I heard someone mention Luciano's name at the club yesterday. That guy across the street. He kind of looks like one of Luciano's old soldiers." "Boss, you think Luciano still has people on the outside?" The psychological impact was gradual but cumulative. Each mention of Lucky's name created a small spike of anxiety in Scalise's mind. Over time, these repeated suggestions began to create a persistent background fear that Lucky remained a threat even from prison. Giuseppe Martino, Scalise's barber, was recruited through a combination of financial incentives and carefully applied pressure. Martino had been cutting Scalise's hair twice weekly for over a decade, making him perfectly positioned to conduct psychological operations during intimate, relaxed moments when Scalise's psychological defenses were reduced. Martino's assignment was to reinforce Torino's psychological suggestions while adding new elements designed to increase Scalise's paranoia and anxiety. During haircuts, Martino would mention customers who had asked about Scalise, describe strangers who had been asking questions about him, and suggest that someone might be watching or following him. The barbershop conversations became a crucial component of the psychological warfare operation. "Mr. Scalise, a man came in yesterday, asking if you still come here regularly. Said he was an old friend, but I didn't recognize him. Boss, I noticed the same car parked outside when you arrived last week and again today. You know, I heard that Luciano's people sometimes wait years before making their move. Very patient, very careful." These suggestions were particularly effective because they were delivered during haircuts, when Scalise was physically vulnerable and psychologically relaxed. The intimate nature of the barber-client relationship made Martino's words carry special weight and credibility. Michael Romano's recruitment was the most crucial and most challenging aspect of the operation. Romano had known Scalise for over 30 years and was one of the few people Scalise trusted completely. Their friendship dated back to childhood, in the same Brooklyn neighborhood, and Romano had remained loyal through Scalise's rise in organized crime. Romano's recruitment required careful pressure applied to his gambling debts and family responsibilities. He owed significant money to several loan sharks and was struggling to support his elderly mother and disabled brother. Lucky's organization offered to resolve his financial problems and provide ongoing support in exchange for his cooperation in the psychological operation against Scalise. Romano's assignment was to express concern for Scalise's safety in ways that would reinforce and amplify the fears being planted by Torino and Martino. His comments would carry the most weight because they came from a lifelong friend who had no apparent motive for deception or manipulation. "Tony, you seem nervous lately. Is everything okay? You are not sleeping well, are you? I heard some guys talking about old scores being settled. Made me think about you and some of the enemies you've made over the years. You know, prison doesn't stop a man like Luciano from arranging things. I've heard stories about people getting hit years after they thought they were safe." The cumulative effect of these three trusted sources consistently reinforcing the same themes: Lucky's potential threat, unknown watchers, possible betrayal, was designed to create a psychological echo chamber that would gradually consume Scalise's mental stability. Each suggestion would reinforce the others, creating a feedback loop of anxiety and paranoia that would intensify over time. Environmental manipulation was the second phase of the psychological warfare operation. Lucky's associates arranged for strangers to appear in places where Scalise conducted regular business, the same unfamiliar faces showing up at different restaurants, social clubs, and business meetings. These watchers never approached Scalise or displayed any obvious threatening behavior, but their repeated presence was designed to reinforce the suggestions he was receiving from his trusted associates. The surveillance was conducted by operatives who had no known connection to Lucky's organization. They were recruited specifically for their ability to blend into different environments while maintaining visibility to the target. Each operative was given specific instructions about where to appear, how long to remain visible, and how to behave to maximize psychological impact without creating legal liability. Car surveillance was conducted in a pattern designed to be noticed but not obviously threatening. The same vehicles would appear behind Scalise's car on different routes, park near his regular destinations, and disappear before he could investigate. The surveillance was obvious enough to be detected, but subtle enough to maintain plausible deniability. The psychological impact was enhanced by the unpredictable nature of the surveillance. Sometimes Scalise would notice followers, sometimes he wouldn't. The inconsistency prevented him from developing effective countermeasures, while maintaining constant uncertainty about whether he was being watched. Phone manipulation became another tool for psychological pressure. Calls to Scalise's home and business numbers were timed to occur at irregular intervals, with the caller hanging up when anyone answered. The calls weren't frequent enough to constitute obvious harassment, but they were persistent enough to create a sense of unseen monitoring that reinforced the psychological suggestions Scalise was receiving from other sources. The timing of the phone calls was carefully calculated to maximize psychological impact. Calls would come late at night when Scalise was trying to sleep, early in the morning when he was most vulnerable, and during business meetings when interruptions would be most stressful. The unpredictable timing prevented habituation while maintaining constant low-level anxiety. The psychological pressure began affecting Scalise's behavior within weeks of the operation's initiation. He became increasingly paranoid about his security arrangements, questioning his bodyguards about their observations and demanding explanations for any unusual occurrences. He changed his daily routines frequently, avoiding patterns that might make him predictable to potential assassins. Sleep became difficult as anxiety about potential threats made relaxation impossible. Scalise began staying awake later, checking security systems multiple times per night, and waking frequently to investigate sounds that might indicate intruders. The sleep deprivation exacerbated his paranoia and made him more susceptible to psychological manipulation. His relationships with associates became strained as suspicion and distrust increased. Scalise began questioning the loyalty of people who had worked for him for years, interpreting normal business conversations as potential signs of betrayal. The paranoia created a self-reinforcing cycle where his suspicions alienated allies and created the very disloyalty he feared. The nightmare phase of the operation began in August 1943, designed to exploit Scalise's deteriorating mental state and push him toward complete psychological breakdown. Lucky had discovered through his psychological research that dream manipulation could be achieved through suggestion, environmental cues, and systematic sleep disruption that would make the subject more susceptible to nightmare content. Dream psychology became Lucky's most sophisticated weapon. He understood that nightmares were manifestations of subconscious fears and anxieties, and that these fears could be programmed through careful manipulation of daytime experiences. By controlling what Scalise thought about during his waking hours, Lucky could influence what he dreamed about during sleep. Torino, Martino, and Romano were given new instructions to plant specific imagery in Scalise's subconscious through carefully timed conversations. References to Lucky Luciano became more specific and threatening. "I heard Luciano never forgets anyone who crosses him. They say he is still planning operations from prison, using visitors to pass messages. Boss, you ever think about what happens when Luciano gets out? Because he will get out eventually." The suggestions included specific imagery designed to program nightmare content, references to bedrooms, midnight visitors, people watching while others sleep, and Lucky's distinctive appearance were woven into conversations in ways that would implant visual and emotional content in Scalise's subconscious mind. Environmental manipulation was intensified to disrupt Scalise's sleep patterns and create anxiety that would carry over into his dream state. Phone calls were timed to occur just after he had fallen asleep, waking him during early sleep cycles when the mind is most vulnerable to suggestion. Strange noises outside his home, cars starting and stopping, footsteps on gravel, dogs barking, were arranged to create a sense of nocturnal threat. The nightmare content was reinforced through subtle daytime suggestions that would program specific scenarios into Scalise's subconscious mind. Conversations would include references to beds, bedrooms, midnight visitors, and people watching while others sleep. The suggestions were indirect but persistent, designed to create dream content featuring Lucky Luciano as a threatening presence in Scalise's most vulnerable moments. The psychological warfare reached its climax in September 1943, when Scalise began experiencing the recurring nightmare of Lucky Luciano appearing in his bedroom. The nightmare followed a consistent pattern. Scalise would be lying in bed, unable to move, while Lucky stood at the foot of the bed speaking in a calm, threatening voice about revenge and retribution. The nightmare was so vivid and consistent that Scalise became afraid to sleep. He began checking his home security multiple times each night, installing additional locks and alarm systems, and sleeping with loaded weapons within easy reach. The fear of sleeping became almost as destructive as the nightmares themselves. Sleep deprivation compounded the psychological pressure, creating a feedback loop where anxiety prevented sleep, which increased anxiety, which made sleep even more difficult. Scalise's decision-making abilities deteriorated, his paranoia intensified, and his ability to distinguish between real and imagined threats became increasingly compromised. The final phase of the operation involved convincing Scalise that his situation was hopeless, and that suicide was preferable to waiting for Lucky's inevitable retaliation. This was accomplished through a combination of isolating him from supportive relationships and reinforcing his belief that escape or protection was impossible. Torino, Martino, and Romano were instructed to express doubt about Scalise's ability to survive a conflict with Lucky's organization. The suggestions weren't direct recommendations for suicide, which would have been obvious and counterproductive. Instead, they were expressions of hopelessness designed to reinforce Scalise's growing belief that his situation was impossible and that no solution existed except escape through death. Boss, maybe you should consider making peace with Luciano's people before it is too late. I don't know if anyone can protect you from someone like that. His reach is too long, his memory too good. Tony, maybe it is time to think about getting out of this business entirely. Some fights you just can't win. The suggestions were delivered with apparent reluctance and concern, making them more credible and psychologically devastating. Each of the three men expressed similar doubts from different perspectives, creating the impression that Scalise's situation was so hopeless that even his closest allies had lost faith in his ability to survive. On the 18th of December 1943, Antonio Scalise was found dead in his Brooklyn home, having shot himself in the head with his personal revolver. The suicide note mentioned fear of retaliation, business pressures, and inability to continue living under constant threat. Police investigation found no evidence of foul play or coercion, concluding that Scalise had taken his own life due to psychological pressure related to his criminal activities. Lucky Luciano had eliminated a dangerous enemy without ordering violence, without risking his associates, and without creating evidence that could be used in criminal prosecution. The psychological warfare operation had achieved perfect results while maintaining complete deniability.